Hello and welcome to Tremors, Making Perfection, the podcast. I'm your host, Michael Gross, and every Friday for the next 6 weeks we're going deep on the making of Tremors with the people who made it. From the very first draft of the script that birthed the Graboids to the challenges of filming in the middle of the desert, the cast and crew are going to tell you everything you need to know about the monster movie that became a cult classic. So Graboid yourself a seat and let's make perfection. Who is the team behind the suspiciously penis-shaped Graboid design? And how did they bring it to life without the help of CGI that we're so used to seeing today? In this episode, visual effects master Alec Gillis talks through how he got into his line of work, the artistry of practical effects, and the challenges of dragging a giant monster puppet out into the middle of nowhere and making it look as terrifying as it does on screen, and still does, after 30 years of technological advancements.
Where does your interest in effects and monsters come from?
My interest in effects, particularly monsters, goes back to childhood, really. My father was a fan of special effects movies and makeup and so on, so he probably let me see some things at a young age that, maybe I shouldn't have seen. And I just kind of always was tinkering in the garage and making little films and so forth. And basically, I think I was never told by anyone, any adult authority figure, that I shouldn't do it or couldn't do it for a living. So it was just sort of a foregone conclusion that I would go into becoming a monster maker.
And were there any films that inspired you?
Yes, my father would show me movies that over my mother's objections, and sometimes he would wake me up, at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, when I was like 5 years old, and say, "You got to come see this," and I'd come out and be rubbing my eyes, what's he talking? And it would be Ray Harryhausen, movie Jason and the Argonauts with the skeletons coming out of the ground and sword fighting. And I think something about being a little kid, impressionable little kid, and having just awakened, these images were kind of burned into my brain. And they just started me off on a life of fascination with creatures and effects. And my dad knew a little bit about how things were done. He could tell me that the original King Kong was that big. And so it was just an amazing world to me that these incredible visuals could be created by, the use of miniatures or rubber or, mechanical means. And so I just had to, I always wanted to peel the layers off and see how things were accomplished.
Steve Wilson mentions Ray Harryhausen as an influence.
Yeah, the work of Ray Harryhausen, the stop motion animator, was influential on a huge number of people of my generation and before. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg also cite him as one of their big inspirations. I know Steve Wilson, the writer and producer of the Tremors series, loves it as well. And it's being passed on to a lot of younger people because it's got his work was so expressive, and he was at the center of it. So he was an artist who was expressing who he was as an artist, not just through the stories that he was creating in these films, but also in the movements and performances of the characters that he designed. So for me, when I realized that there was a single person who was responsible for most of my favorite monsters, I thought, well, that's what I got to do. I've got to be that person.
Can you describe what your life was like back then?
In 1987, I think it was, I had worked for Stan Winston for a few years. Tom Woodruff had worked there for 5 years. And Stan did a little movie called Pumpkinhead that he directed, and Tom and I were part of the team that created the effects for that film. And Stan at that point announced that he was not going to be doing effects anymore for the movie industry at large. He was just going to do them for his own films. So that meant, to me, oh, I don't get to work with James Cameron or Robert Zemeckis or all of these other filmmakers that I'd hoped to work for. it will only be for Stan. I love Stan. He was my mentor, but he was also carrying a kind of a big crew of people out of loyalty. So I thought, well, you know what? I'm not in this I'm in this for my own self-expression, and I'm an artist. I've got to make my own way. So I told Stan that I was ready to leave, and he very quickly said, "Well, thank you very much," because I think he was happy to have me off payroll. But it was all with the best of intent, and we were friendly about it all. And Tom came to the same conclusion shortly thereafter, and we were kind of kicking around going, well, what do we do? How do we, I've got a wife who's expecting a child and just bought a house, and he's saying, yeah, I just bought a house too, and what are we going to do? I think Tom had a little kid at the time. So we thought, well, maybe we'll team up, and we had a script that we had written that we had presented to Gail Hurd, and it got a good reaction. Her people really liked it, and we thought, naively, here we go, we're going to make a little movie, and we'll bring the project back to Stan, and Stan's guys can do the effects, and maybe Stan will want to direct it, and of course, as these things go, it didn't, and so the movie never got made, and then we were worried, and then we were saying how do we make a living? What do we so we decided to start a company, and that's what, after some languishing and after a lot of worry, Tremors was the first feature that we did as ADI.
Kevin Bacon, Fred Ward, Tremors.
Can you walk me through the first incarnations of the Graboids?
Well, the design of the Graboids was very loosely described in the script. I believe it was a really nice, kind of loaded little sentence. It said the worm's head opens up like a grotesque flower, and we thought that's evocative, right? It doesn't take a lot of words but that's really all the description was. There was a conversation. What are they? Are they prehistoric? Are they alien? And so we liked the ambiguity, and the script never answered the question as to what their origins were. So that gave us a lot of freedom to start designing. So Tom and I would bring these books to the meetings and spread these nature books out, and everybody would page through them. We would have gone through and put post-it marks on images of creatures that we like, and then it just became sort of this blender of well, here's what everybody likes, here's textures that people are responding to, and things that they don't respond to, and what the director doesn't respond to is every bit as valuable as what the director responds to. So we just started sketching and doing loose drawings, and we were kind of smitten by the heads of snapping turtles, which did survive into the look of the finished Graboid, that kind of hooked beak sort of thing. But some snapping turtles have, which is pretty neat, is that they can draw their heads back into this pile of flesh around them and sort of extra protection. So we thought that would be cool if they ram up and they're just sort of this you don't know what this thing is. It's just like a giant muscle, that comes up and then this head extrudes out from inside this flesh. And we did some sketches, and Gail said, this is not going to be a movie about giant dicks chasing people through the desert. And we were like, oh, I guess it does kind of look like that, doesn't it? So we circumcised the worms and exposed the head of the worm. And it was a really nice, we just thought there might be an extra beat. We're actually riffing on what Cameron did with the Queen, where when you first see the Queen, the head pushes out from under the shell. But that didn't, it was a totally different application. And Gail was right. She was correct. She said, I showed my this drawing to the women in the audience. There's no way we're making a movie like that. So we learned our lesson, and we were grateful to Gail for that observation.
And how would circumcising them make them any less phallic?
Well, I guess it depends on which part of the world you're in. Right?
What's the name of...
That's how they get you. They're under the goddamn ground.
What the hell are they?
how'd you go about constructing a graboid?
Yeah, the graboids were one of the larger creatures that had been done as puppets, if you will, at that point, and certainly for our shop. So we had to really sort of think hard about how we were going to accomplish this. And what we came up with was we pitched a split between full-scale and miniature versions. And this split had worked well on Aliens, and Gail spoke that language. We'd all been through that together. And so we said, like, let's have, a decent schedule of a miniature tabletop shoot wherein we can have full-body worms that are squirming around, and we'll do them in a variety of ways. We'll make them hand puppets, we'll make mechanical, cable-operated tentacle mechs and all that kind of stuff, and we'll put them in miniature sets. And you may as well get the Skotek brothers, Robert and Dennis, who won an Oscar for Aliens, to do all that work, and we'll put our monsters into the... And Gail was like, no-brainer, that's perfect. Then that left us with the full scale, which was, well, how are we going to accomplish it? At that time in our career, we had not done big hydraulic mechanisms, and not a lot of people had for movies, especially when you start thinking, well, these are going to be out in the desert with the grit of the sand. We got to dig deep holes and put these, heavy mechanisms. So we're like, let's just make it a big body puppet, right? We'll put Tom Woodruff in the puppet at times. And so we built a rig that Tom could hold the head up, and it had a support on it, so it took the weight off. And then we had other puppeteers, off screen with 20-foot cables leading to giant levers that would open and close the mouth. And between those two approaches, we created the illusion of these very energetic and athletic monster worms.
And what materials did you use?
Well, to create the graboids, we would start with a clay sculpture, a full-scale clay sculpture. It was at least a ton of clay. And then from that, we would make large fiberglass negative molds. And then into the negative molds, we would pour our foam latex. And foam latex is a fantastic material that I think its first use was on The Wizard of Oz for facial appliances. But it's comparatively lightweight and comparatively durable. You have to do a lot of reinforcing. But basically, you're doing a big, giant skin of rubber and creating an understructure inside it that holds its shape. I think in our case, we ended up just doing hoops of aluminum, so it was like a big hoop skirt. So we could get some jiggle out of it, and you could have a person inside it operating it and, creating a lot of activity. Our goal was to make it as lightweight as possible, but when you get into this kind of sculptural detail that we had going on that character, you can't really use theatrical techniques or theatrical materials like gossamer fabrics and things that you see in stagecraft. It has to be, it has to look like the real thing. And along with that, those specs come some weight issues as well. So we had a lot of exhausted puppeteers. Tom Woodruff, as I mentioned, was in the hole a lot, doing a lot of the puppeteering, and then I was outside the pits with our other puppeteers, directing the performance of tentacles coming out of mouths and jaw parts opening and closing, and et cetera. We occasionally had some breakage of the graboids, that happens. Cables will snap, especially when you're puppeteering. Like we had, big levers and cables that would open and close the side mandibles and the jaw, but those mandibles would bash into the ground. We would dig a hole and then create a berm around it, and then we'd have to sort of, place the creature out past that berm so its mouth could open, because it didn't have the power to just push dirt away. But there were times where when the coordination of the puppeteering gets out of sync and the head rolls and somebody gives it a good yank to give a good strong opening and it just hits the ground, it's not going anywhere. So that force has to, it snaps the cable, and then you have to stop and replace the cable, or more than likely what it would do, it would break the cable at the controller end. So we would just cut the housing of the cable, pull more of the cable itself out, wind it around the pulley, and go. So as we shot, the controllers were getting inching towards the creature regularly. And then we'd take it back to the train station where we were based, and at the end of the day, and start making repairs. And we repaired things quite often, repainted things, and because we put them through a lot.
What a way to make a living, eh?
I got it.
Can you walk us through the scene in the movie where the graboid bursts through the floor?
The attack on Walter Chang's store starts with a graboid busting up through the floor. So for those interiors, the store had been built in Valencia on a soundstage, and we shot surrounding footage, and we shot all that. I'm trying to think if the floor itself was a cutaway, but we had a big in the soundstage. There was a big sunken area. It was like a water tank in this soundstage, and they built the store over top of it, and that enabled us to put a big track down, lay a big track. This was Art Brewer and his physical effects guys had this track with a I think it was probably a Chapman dolly on it with a boom arm that could do this. So we rigged our worm onto that boom arm so we could get a running start with this thing of maybe 15, 20 feet with 10 guys pushing with all their might and cranking it up right at the right time and hitting those floorboards and busting through. Lots of Fuller's Earth. Ivo Cristante was a genius with his breakaways and all the sets that he designed. And so we got that initial shot of the creature bursting up, and then we had multiple rigs to get, Walter Chang into the mouth of the character, and we came up with this idea of what if the tentacles wrap around him, they spike into him, they pull him in, but he gets pulled in and his leg ends up at a weird, awkward angle, breaking, so the leg is, sticking out awkwardly. So we made a little, we cast the actor's leg and made a puppeted leg that sticks out, so that he can look extra pathetic. But there was a lot of work in that set, in the attack of tentacles grabbing things and all the shelves falling over, and that was intercut with work that was done on location, where the roof of the store was pitching and yawing. They called it the rock and roll roof, and it was all built. Again, Ivo had the same sort of limitations that we had, where, you weren't really, you didn't really have the budget to do fancy hydraulics and anything like that. So you had to come up with ways that were safe for actors, but also reliable and simple in their construction. So we were doing things that, practical solutions to things that no doubt had been done since movie making began. Which was kind of cool because we were out in Lone Pine where they've been making movies since movies began.
And I guess with Tremors, it's really, really unusual for a horror movie to be set outdoors in broad daylight.
Yes, the marching order of putting these graboids out in broad daylight was a bit daunting. We had come off of movies like Predator and Aliens where it's usually set at night, and there's a lot that's forgiving and a lot that helps you because it's what you don't see in horror films that scares you as much or more than what you do see, because it lets the audience's imagination run wild. In this case, we knew at some point there had to be a big payoff where in broad daylight you see these creatures and they've got to be scary. But what was baked into the script, and what is the brilliance of Steve and Brent's writing, is that you had a lead up to it, so that your imagination was already engaged and activated by seeing the mounds of dirt, and things jiggling and dust puffs and things like that, before you got to see what the creature actually looked like. And then, of course, the mislead that when they pull the tongues off the underside of truck and you think, oh, that's what it is. It's like a bunch of weird snake monsters. But no, it's only a hint at a larger creature. So it was paid out very nicely. Beyond that, these creatures had characters. They were learning, and they were naturalistic, and they were behaving like intelligent animals. And our characters understood that, so there was that sort of cat and mouse thing going on towards the end of the film, which was an extra level for a non-anthropomorphic character to do that kind of thing was very fresh to us and very exciting.
And how do you go about blending 3D models with CGI?
In the case of Aftershocks, the CGI technology was relatively new then. So there were a lot of unknowns for us as VFX artists. So we worked closely with Phil and his company to make sure that we were not presenting them with textures or stretchy skin or anything like that might create a problem for them on that budget. We understand that they could solve any problem with enough money, but when you're talking about a lower budgeted film, you have to be mindful of the budget. So like, for instance, one of the things Phil said was, well, if the legs can be more socketed rather than skin stretching, webbing between leg and body, that would be helpful. So we looked at the rhinoceros, for instance, and said, oh, look at that. Look at how there's a big sort of like fender that comes over the top of the thigh that's a big, meaty, armored plate. So we adopted that as a design cue to sort of help them in their animation work. And then, we just would provide them with the models that they could photograph or scan, all the parts and pieces that they need so that the match would be as close as it could be. And then also, for us, we come from an era where you were a little more permissive of continuity kind of mismatches. If it was to get a better dynamic or to improve the action, there tends to be a mindset, a modern mindset where, no, it has to look exact, the full scale thing has to look exact, otherwise it's a failure. And that's not really the case, and Phil saw it that way as well. Like, well, so what, in that shot, their feet, aren't as big because they're that close to the, you can tweak things, you can move it and squish it and it's malleable, and the composite impression cut to cut is what counts in the end. And Phil was a very, because he comes from a practical world and had transitioned into the digital world, he was the perfect guy for Aftershocks.
Something's wrong with our worm, Earl.
Well, what do you want me to do about it?
Have a look at this. A lady in Bulgaria made it.
Oh, so this is that is fantastic. See, this is the kind of thing that I want to see more of. I think the world needs more penis cozies in the shape of a graboid. And this actually goes right back to what Gail Hurd was talking about, doesn't it? So she couldn't have foreseen this. If there was a proper merchandising campaign back then our uncircumcised worms might have been quite a hit. You can imagine all the various products that we could have produced. I like it. Tremors, cock cozies.
What does it feel like when you look back at your personal videos and photos from that time and from the Tremors shoot?
I love looking back at our archival footage because, first of all, I mean, you look at it from several different vantage points, right? Like, I look back 30 years later and go, my God, how young we were. Who would have hired us? How could they possibly have thought we knew what we were doing? But then I look at the work and I go like, oh, that's pretty cool. Especially how it looks in the film. Because there's always things that you pick apart in your mind and things you never liked and you wished you had done differently. But the film is just so damn good. And it holds up so well. It's such a great, monsters aside, it's such a great ensemble film and the balance of characters and the clearly defined characters' dialogues, beautifully directed, beautifully written. So when I look back at it, I just get a warm, fuzzy feeling, and I'm just very proud to have been chosen to be part of it, because I think anybody who worked with that group of people making those creature effects would have come off looking good. And I know I'm being a little self-effacing when I say that, because it's not that I'm saying that what we did wasn't a good portion of it, but it was just such a lightning in a bottle. It was a great time and a great group of people. And I think when you watch the movie, it's one of the movies that from that era that I've worked on personally, that I can say it holds up better across the board than some other movies that I've worked on.
And it was your first big job on your own. What was that like?
The enthusiasm was just sky high. So all of those things, like, the very cold, the very hot, the very dusty, the exhaustion factor, those were all sort of secondary to me, because the vision as it was laid out in the script and the opportunity that we were given was so, it was just, it was worth the work, and it still is worth the work, because at the end of the day, you don't really think so much about the hardship or the problems you had, because the end result was so great. And even if the movie hadn't been that great, it would still be one of my fondest memories, because the people were so wonderful, and the location was so beautiful. And, you get to get up every morning and see the sunrise at Lone Pine and, go eat at a little funky cafe. And there was like one bar in the town where the crew would meet and fraternize and have a couple of beers. And then you go back to the little dumpy motel, and it was just it was filmmaking heaven.
And is there a sentence that sums up your experience, your feelings for Tremors?
I wish I had the single sentence that sums up Tremors, because I would ask the marketing department to put it on the poster so that the movie would be a big, gigantic hit theatrically. Tremors to me was sort of the little movie that could. It wasn't a big budget movie, but what it had going for it carried it even past a bad box office performance into cult status, and then beyond cult status and into a franchise that continues on to this day. In that regard, it's one of the most successful movies I've ever been involved with. And I think it has shown me that everything is not sort of the way Hollywood presents it, where it's sort of, like you go out with a big ad campaign, and if it doesn't make, $20 million in its first weekend, everybody's disappointed. Tremors was an independent style film that sort of like latched onto people's hearts and has only continued to grow. So that's a great lesson as an artist. If you're an artist, you have an intent for your piece of artwork, and it could go one way or go another. It has its own life, and you can't really evaluate the success of your piece of art. It's up to others to evaluate it, and that changes over time. So you can't even worry about it. You just have to control your own process and enjoy the process as you execute, because there isn't really anything else under your control other than the process. And Tremors was a great example of that for all of us. How is that for a sentence? You know what? You do the podcast thing where you click a button and it goes at 1.5 times. All I want to say is I am booking a trip to Bulgaria as soon as I'm out of this chair. I'm just glad. I will continue until my dying day, hauling myself out for any way to be a part of the celebration of Tremors, because I think it's worth it, and I think anyone that sees the film, generally, it sparks something in them. I showed it to my daughter, I think, at a screening when she was about maybe 12, and she just said, "Dad, I have a huge crush on Kevin Bacon." And that's one thing, that's something. Who doesn't have a crush on Kevin Bacon?
That was special effects master Alec Gillis talking Tremors. Meet us back here next Friday, where we'll be joined by the director that coaxed such fantastic performances out of those giant graboids, Ron Underwood. In the meantime, if you want to brush up on your survival skills in the event of a graboid invasion, head over to the official Tremors YouTube and Facebook channel, or find us on Twitter and Instagram @TremorsMovie. Over and out.